the Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Hello, podcast listeners. I think it's time to restate the purpose of the Catholic Men's Podcast. I just did my 120th episode, and I've been going since 2018, I think? I can't really remember. If you're new around here, I already said most of why I started this podcast in episode 1, The Striped Chest by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But I think it's time, just so people know what they're listening to restate the purpose of this podcast and add to my previous explanation, because so many things have changed since then. There is so much trash in the entertainment world. If you're a Catholic with your head screwed on right, I don't have to explain that statement. When an average moral person, through no fault of their own, sees unmentionable things in a YouTube ad or just casually browsing the internet, you know the world's messed up. That's not even mentioning Hollywood movies that have refined special effects to such a staggering degree. They can play hob with your emotions at the drop of a hat. Being up against all that competition, how do you encourage the average Catholic to read anything? And I mean anything at all. Reading is becoming a lost skill. According to the U.S. Department of Education, 54% of U.S. adults aged 16 to 74 years old, about 130 million people, lack proficiency in literacy, reading below the equivalent of a 6th grade level. As of 2022, 33% of high school graduates never read another book the rest of their lives, and 42% of college grads never read another book after college. 70% of U.S. adults haven't been in a bookstore in the last 5 years, and 80% of U.S. families did not buy or read a book last year. Excuse all the stats, but honestly, who can say if reading will still be a thing in 30 years? I don't know what's going to happen. So with all that going on in the world today, with that context, I started a podcast about finding good literature for Catholic gentlemen to read. But as I went along, I realized that more and more children started to listen. And of course, that's the age when you should form your taste for good moral stories. So I made a segment for younger people on the show called The Salty Dog Storytime. I've always believed, and this has been backed up by Catholic thinkers far wiser than me, that when someone is forming their reading habits, they should read whatever they want as long as it's not immoral. That's the only way you can form a taste for books. In other words, what are well-told stories, and what are badly told stories? You'll never know until you've read both. When up against million-dollar Hollywood productions and debauched social media or YouTube, I'm happy people are reading moral books at all. Reading a variety of different topics and genres, that makes a man cultured. I don't really respect any man who thinks he's cultured or educated, but can't converse comfortably with both scholars and children. Our Lord made both a priority. He used parables for the simpler folk and postulates for the church doctors. It's absurd to think that people who haven't really read anything extensively can start out with an in-depth book on forming an interior life. It's just not gonna happen. I believe everyone should read the classics, even though some are even pagan, like the Odyssey or the Iliad, because there are so many references to them in other literature that you might read. Just as an aside, I hate the Odyssey, but I had to read it because it's good to know what people are referencing all the time. Just like someone may never use geometry in their life, but it's definitely good to know what a triangle is. Yes, the Odyssey is pagan, but you can't run from paganism. It has resurfaced and surrounds us everywhere today. But sometimes you have to study a disagreeable thing so that you know how to refute and reject it. Take care, therefore, when reading things that are still moral but not quite the ideal, to not let the tendencies enter your everyday life. Just like I personally would still learn kung fu or karate, even though it's infected with some Eastern Gnostic tendencies, and I would have to take care not to let it change my mentality. I would learn jujitsu, but would never ever grapple with a woman because I don't think it's moral for a Catholic gentleman to do so. Back to the matter at hand, Ideally, a Catholic should read The Soul of the Apostolate, Introduction to the Devout Life, True Devotion to Mary, the Catechist, the Bible, but he'll never read them if he hasn't first read Mary Had a Little Lamb or learned his ABCs. So for the purposes of this podcast, for everyone on the internet, with readers of every level, my ideal is to have material for every different type of person, young and old. So if a podcast doesn't really suit your fancy, just wait around because I'm sure there will be an episode that'll fit your reading level or stage of interior life. I've read on the podcast The Catechist, Soul of the Apostolate, and The Secret of the Rosary. I've even read about Skanderbeg and Our Lady of Good Counsel. But I've also read everything from adventure novels, fairy tales, and mystery stories, like The Whipping Boy or The Worm of Lambton. How can I read secular stories and still call this the Catholic Men's Podcast? Simple. Because all good and moral Western literature is a fruit of Christian civilization and should be told. Nobody would have been writing Treasure Island in the Roman times because they were still using all their time fighting wars or just trying to find clean water. That's an exaggeration, but only after our Lord came and the Catholic Church was instituted did civilization truly start to thrive. Look at the medieval monks. They drained swamps and taught their parishioners how to use a knife and fork. They didn't tear down the civilizations before them, but they baptized it and built upon it. When monks heard the story of Beowulf in Viking culture, they didn't destroy it and bury it. No, they inserted some Catholic elements into it and Christianized it. But here's the clincher of this whole episode. If I can imagine some poor wayfarer in this misbegotten revolutionary world stumbling upon my podcast, and I were able to distract him from sin for 10 minutes, I would consider that the highest possible reward for my services. Thank you all so much for your support for this podcast through the years, and please keep me in your prayers. I have a lot more episodes lined up for you in the future. Pax Christi, and Godspeed.